Hey, what's up? And welcome into Under the Hood with Jonathan Hood. Thanks so much for downloading the podcast and checking us out on YouTube, youtube.com. Look for Under the Hood with Jonathan Hood. The link is in the bio for you to subscribe and take a look at everything we do with Under the Hood with Jonathan Hood. Thank you so much for your support on everything we do on Under the Hood with Jonathan Hood. Today's podcast is going to be a lot different than what we usually do on Under the Hood, as this show is always a conduit to what we do on the Cap and J Hood Morning Show, weekday morning 6 to 9 on ESPN 1000 and on the ESPN Chicago app, because on Friday evening, we learned that a titan in Chicago sports talk radio has passed away, and that is Terry Boers. January 23rd, 2026, Terry Boers has passed away. And I worked with Terry a lot in my career. I'm going to go through it with you and tell you the connection I had with Terry Boers, who has passed away. And I can't believe I'm saying those words, but I am, that Terry has passed away. So my start in the sports radio business at WSCR began in 1992. And at that time, I was an intern in 1992. Starting in 1994, I was an associate producer during that time. I was an associate engineer. I was an executive producer and a host between 94 and 2005. And so you could say that I grew up in the business of Chicago sports radio during that time. I'm still in college, and I was able to parlay what I did in college, what I did as an intern, to be able to have a full-time career in sports talk radio. And where I discovered Terry Boers was not in sports radio initially. It was in the Chicago Sun-Times, a day where, when you were a columnist, you were able to speak your mind and just be able to praise and also criticize ownership in Chicago sports. It wasn't about relationships and behind the scenes, up the back stairs kind of relationships with owners and general managers and players. No, you're an independent journalist where you sit down at the typewriter or the computer and you would just give your thoughts about the state of Chicago sports, depending on what the topic was. And Terry was very polarizing as a writer. He was compelling, but also very polarizing, because he would write some things that I think many fans thought. Of course, he had more of a learned opinion because he had the facts and had all the numbers and quotes, anonymous and on the record, and everything else in between, to be able to put together some really compelling columns. And I know that there's a lot of Chicago sports fans that were like, man, I'm with you, Terry. And some would say, this is garbage. I can't believe he's saying this about my favorite team, my favorite general manager, my favorite player, whatever. But that's the business of being a columnist, to be able to give your point of view and let the people be able to judge for themselves. And Terry was excellent at it as a journalist. So he's able to parlay his time as a journalist into Chicago sports radio. WSCR, it was started in 1992, and they were looking for people. And during that time, you started to see more and more writers be able to get on sports talk radio, because it's one thing to have the column, but also you want to be able to promote your column and yourself by the spoken word. And 3 or 4 hours a day on sports radio, it's great for the newspaper, great for your brand, and also great to be able to elevate a radio station. And Terry Boers was one of the originals at WSCR doing Afternoon Drive with Dan McNeil. I don't know if those two, McNeil and Boers, are in the Hall of Fame, but I think that they should be. The Chicago Sports Hall of Fame, because those guys were different than Dan Jiggetts and Mike North. They were different than Tom Scher. They were different than Mike Murphy during that time. They just did it the way they wanted to do it. It was a different style for McNeil and Boers. After the high intensity of Jiggetts and North, here comes McNeil and Boers, and they were the guys in the back of the classroom throwing spitballs at everybody, laughing at everybody, and also doing, obviously, great, compelling sports talk, and just the way that McNeil drove the show during that time, and Boers was there just to laugh and to be able to have strong opinions. And it was just a great blend between those two for a long time. So from Terry writing to be able to parlay that and retire from the newspaper to do sports radio full time, a number of people were doing that across the board in sports radio as a genre anyway. So at the time that I was at WSCR, I was working evenings. I was producing evenings. I was producing the Mike Murphy show on the evenings and weekends. And I was just trying to cut my teeth in the business by working with Murphy, working weekend shows, just to try to have an understanding, especially with me as a producer, to look at it and say, okay, if when I get my shot to host, these are things that I'm going to do and things that I certainly will not do. I always had a yellow pad to be able to write down the things like, okay, when I get my shot, this is how I'm going to do things. This is going to be my style. And when you are in your early 20s and you're around a lot of these to be Chicago sports radio legends, it kind of molds who what your opinion is. It molds your style when you're around this all the time. Um, and so I think that when I think of Terry being irreverent, and I think of Terry being funny and humorous, and also the tell it like it is type of let it rip style, I think I adopted some of that as well as a sports talk radio host because there's only one way to do it. I mean, we're in a major market like Chicago. You just can't bullshit the audience. I know that there's a number of people, even today, that will try to BS the audience and make things seem different than what it really is. But I think that we in Chicago, especially you as a listener, you as a consumer, you know BS when you hear it or when you see it. And so there's only one way to be, and that's authentic. However you are, whether however the people take it, you have to be authentic. You have to be able to give what how you feel about certain things and not hold back just because there's people in front offices listening. You don't hold back just because you might be friends with players. And for Terry, for someone who's a columnist, independent journalist, working for the Chicago Sun-Times, independent as far as his thoughts are concerned, he was not concerned about being friends with Jerry Reinsdorf or Jerry Krause. Even though he covered the Chicago Bulls for a long time, he still would be a columnist writing about the Bulls, things he didn't like about Jerry Krause, things that he didn't like about some of the coaching and some of the players. He wrote about those things as a beat reporter as well with the Bulls. So I appreciate that as a fan. It was times I disagreed when I read, but still the point is that that's the essence of the business for us to agree or disagree and have discourse about it. And Terry was very good at that as a journalist. So as I was saying, I was working evenings with Mike Murphy. There was a change in the schedule where Dan Bernstein started to work evenings and I was producing his shows. It was a solo Dan Bernstein show. And we were working evenings. I was his executive producer, and we worked 6:30 to 10. And all of a sudden, there was another change in the schedule where everything was turned upside down. And all of a sudden, Dan and I, who were working evenings together, was elevated to mid mornings. And Terry Boers went from afternoons to mid mornings. And all of a sudden, Boers and Bernstein was born. Boers and Bernstein. I was one of the producers. Matt Fishman was the executive producer of Boers and Bernstein. So the four of us worked together in this strange 8 to noon shift that I've never worked before in my career. But because changes were made, it was Boers and Bernstein and Matt Fishman and I producing this brand new show. And I just remember how awkward it was because McNeil and Boers was a brand, and a brand that people wanted not only in Chicago but also in other places where there was a thought that possibly Boers and Bernstein, or rather McNeil and Boers, would go someplace else in Minneapolis, St. Paul, or some other places and do kind of a Midwestern show more than a Chicago show. They were wanted and they were a hot commodity, and that team was broken up and it became Boers and Bernstein. And I just remember those early days where it was uncomfortable radio because Terry didn't want to get up in the morning, get to the office at 6 a.m. for an 8 o'clock show. And Bernstein was just like, okay, he and I came from nights. We were fine with it. I just remember the meeting back on 4949 West Belmont, because that's where WSCR was. And we were in the alley of all places and having a meeting, not in the offices. They were too small. I remember a meeting with the then program director, Ron Gleason. And Ron Gleason was out there, and I was out there with Fish and Boers and Bernstein. And I recall Ron asking both Boers and Bernstein. So how do you see the show? How do you see the show? And Bernstein said, well, number one, we're not doing Who You Crappin', which was a staple of the afternoon show that Terry left. He says, we're not doing Who You Crappin'. And Terry's like, hell with that. It's like, yes, we are going to do Who You Crappin'. That's coming with me. That's part of my brand. We're doing Who You Crappin'. And so Dan had to back down on that one. But that was something that Bernstein did not want to do. I remember that at the time in that meeting. And just the kind of disagreements and stylistically, it was not gelling early very well. But then they got rolling. And I think that Fishman and I had something to do with them gelling to be able to be a better combination early on. And they just took off from there. One of the longest running talk shows in the history of Chicago sports radio. So that was great to be able to work with them and work with Terry every day. For someone who I read in the Chicago Sun-Times and listened to on the radio weekends and also working with Dan McNeil, it was just great to work with Terry every day. He was a sweetheart of a guy to work with. He was always open to ideas. He was not necessarily a meeting guy. He was always a conversation guy. Would I be out there in the alley behind the station on Belmont Avenue, just smoking, having a little cigar, just smoking, and just kind of pontificating about the games of the day, the stories of the day, and go, okay, we're ready. He was not one of these guys that was regimented and just like he wanted things at a certain time. He just loved the free flow. I come to learn in this business that a lot of the guys that did sports, as far as columnists and writing, I learned that a lot of these guys, their personalities came from the press box. If you ever been to a sports media press box, I don't know how it is in 2026 as much, but back in the day in the 80s and 90s, where you could just let stuff rip. You know, you just someone would say something in a crowded press box and the whole press box would laugh. Terry was one of those guys would say something and then it would just go all the way through the press box and people would laugh. Because, you know, even though you're working and you're watching a ball game, it would be nothing like someone saying something funny to kind of break the tension. You know, a long baseball game, 3 hours sitting in there. Hey, someone's going to say something funny. And Terry would be one of those guys that would say something funny to just break the monotony of every day covering a basketball beat, every day covering a baseball beat, football, whatever. Terry would be one of those guys that was so funny and so hilarious and would say things that, you know, might be blue to some people, some that would love that kind of sense of humor, but that's who he was. What I'm going to miss is something that I think we miss a lot in our business, and that is just being authentic and not worrying about, okay, well, is she going to be offended? Is he going to be offended? There's always a line. I always thought that Terry was right there at the line. He was always dancing on the line. And because I think that these are the things that he'd say, and definitely he would say in the offices, things that he would say at a bar, things that he would say with his family. And I love him being authentic. And that's the thing that I think I'm going to definitely miss about Terry is working with him every day as a producer. And I learned through him that it's okay to be able to laugh. It's okay to be able to have a sense of humor. It's okay to be able to have a blend of here's a strong comment, but also here's something that's a little bit light. And I'm going to miss him because he was such a compelling figure in Chicago sports talk radio. Um, the director of content for ESPN 1000, Danny Zetterman, worked with Terry Boers, just like I did. Jesse Rogers worked with Terry Boers, even though Jesse worked the midday shows. You know, Jesse worked with Terry. Mike North, who's with us at ESPN 1000, working with Carmen DeFalco on their show. Mike obviously worked with them, and we all knew and loved Terry because he was just different than so many others. And again, it's one of those things where you can disagree with some of the things he said, but the point is, though, is that if nothing else, he was compelling and interesting. And I just remember on my old night show on Under the Hood or Chicago's Game Night, whatever they wanted to call my show, that I would put Terry on, and that made a ripple effect across Chicago sports radio. Like, how are you having this WSCR guy on your show, Hood? How is that happening? I had him on my show because he was retired, and I always thought that Terry and I had such a relationship that I would just call my friend and have him on to talk baseball. He wasn't on the air, but I just wanted to hear my friend's voice selfishly. And he knew that he was on ESPN 1000. He had I think he had a book and he had things that he wanted to talk about, and I put him on. And I know that that kind of crossover kind of messed with people's heads. Like, why is he on 1000? He never worked with 1000. Didn't have to, because when you're a titan in our business, he can go anywhere and say whatever he wants. And I gave him that platform. I'm going to be able to dig through the archives of my old show and be able to put that on the podcast for those of you listening. And also, I'll try to find that and put that on YouTube as well, because he was on my show several times, and I just want to hear my friend's voice because I hadn't heard it in a long time. And we had a relationship not just because we worked together. We had a relationship because we both had the love for baseball, and Terry loved baseball, and so did I. We would talk about like West Coast games and talk about the Cubs and White Sox, but he, deep in his heart, he loved baseball just like I did, and we'd have all these conversations and laugh about certain things in baseball and sports in general. But we had a lot of fun, and working with him and Dan Bernstein, it did wonders for my career because Terry was so open and fun that I felt the license to be open and fun because, like I mentioned, there was tension early in that show. And I felt like I wanted to make sure that those guys were loose and having fun because they were in an odd shift, as I mentioned, 8 to noon. And so there's people that's on their way to work, but yet in the office. This is before you could listen live on a link. So what we want to do is try to make it as fun and light as compelling as possible. And I think that Fishman and I accomplished that while we produced their show. So this was a difficult one, but I just want to say all the best to Terry and his family through a very, very difficult situation. All of the people that listened to Terry Boers over the years, they got a kick out of Terry, got mad at Terry, whatever. Um, this is a difficult day because a guy that was a sports writer crosses over sonically and was able to entertain people, millions, for a long, long time. Before YouTube was a thing, before podcast was a thing, he was a must listen on sports talk radio for many people. And so I'm going to say goodbye to my friend because this is very difficult. Thanks so much for listening and watching Under the Hood with Jonathan Hood.